Hello and welcome to another Atypical and Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan MS Pierce, for the Frontline update on the 20th of December 2022, getting very close to Christmas. What do I have to say? Well, the overnight news, there is some news from yesterday actually. Putin met with the Belarus leader Lukashenko, and Lukashenko has traditionally in this conflict been navigating a very fine line between overt support for Russia and not support for Russia. And in fact, he's allowed Russia to train the troops in Belarus, allowed the airfields to be used for springboards of aerial attacks, but hasn't committed troops, hasn't committed the land of Belarus to be a springboard to attack Ukraine directly. Although training facilities are used within Belarus, so he's basically said, "I'm supporting the Russian war effort enough, but I'm not going over this kind of red line here, which means that we are both complicit in this war to the same degree as each other." And in that way, he's kind of appeased Putin just enough without annoying both his general public and his military, and of course committing troops to their ultimate death. And therefore he's annoyed the West enough, but not like too much, not as much as Russia. And so he's in this kind of murky middle area. And if he stays there, then he can probably, after the war finishes, extricate Belarus from a really tricky geopolitical situation that Russia wouldn't be able to do, maybe. So he's been quite wily. And with Putin meeting Lukashenko yesterday, the idea, one assumes, is that Putin was going to try and get Belarus and Lukashenko to commit fully. Remember that the foreign minister was assassinated when he came back from the CSTO meetings in the Caucasus, in the sort of Eurasian area recently, and that was a message to say you need to get on side and help us with the war efforts directly. Well, it looks like he may still be in the same position he was before Putin went over, so that's quite interesting, certainly useful for Ukraine, because if Belarus committed their entire army, their entire military, and their country, the geography of Belarus, to the war for Russia, then that would be an extra headache. I mean, it's not the biggest, best army or anything like that, but it would be more detrimental to Ukraine's efforts than not. So that is a really important positioning for Lukashenko and Belarus. And then moving on, Igor Girkin, who he's a very prominent nationalistic military blogger who was in charge of the Little Green Men in 2014 down in Donbass, in fact, in charge of the militia down there, and then has come back and has become this military blogger, then went down for a bit of a volunteer effort on the front line, but then was kind of his papers didn't come through and wasn't particularly needed. I think he was too sort of toxic, possibly. Went back to being a military blogger back in Russia, and has now yesterday amplified the voice of a really critical volunteer, which is to say that he agrees with that position. And the volunteer forecasted that Russian forces will have to surrender more cities and even full oblasts to Ukraine, as they'll be unable to defend against a possible winter counteroffensive. And Gherkin's amplification of such a forecast suggests he may agree with it. Gherkin's own extremely pessimistic forecasts have been surprisingly accurate, including his critiques of the failure to effectively generate Russian military volunteers in May that has carried over to current mobilization efforts of the disproportionately high Russian price paid for the limited gain of the capture of Lysychansk in July, and of Russian logistics lines' continued vulnerability to HIMARS strikes across the theatre. Other prominent military bloggers have kind of ignored what Gherkin said yesterday, but it's interesting that there is this tension between some of the military bloggers who are really highly critical of Russia's efforts, and this has then prompted the Russian military command to try and get these military bloggers on side. So this is when they start doing more harsh things and more strident military activities to try and appease the rabid right in Russia. They're trying to again navigate this difficult line between making sensible decisions on decisions that won't basically kill huge amounts of Russian troops, and then trying to abide with the wishes of these nationalistic, fervent nationalists back in Russia. So, that's been difficult. Donetsk People's Republic is reportedly clashing with other pro-Russian authorities about basic administrative functions, and that's an interesting sort of outcome that again speaks to these tensions that exist within Russia and within the Russian forces and their kind of allies, if you will, or the occupied forces in this case. Um, and that's all very interesting. So, going on to the normal daily reports from the Ukraine forces about the Russian losses. Again, pinch of salt, propaganda, all that kind of stuff. We don't have the equivalent Russian statistics, so stop bringing that up. I will report these because at least there's some figures available. You can cut it by 40%, 30%, 50%. You still got pretty high numbers. It gives you some kind of idea, particularly of the figures below the liquidated personnel as to what's been going on the day before. 430 men, so slightly down on what there has been over the last week. 7 tanks, 5 APCs, 7 artillery pieces. I always say that's the most important number, and 23 UAVs. That's going to be part of the figure that came out from the drone attacks the night before, not last night, the night before, but some of those figures came in yesterday because these figures get generated in the morning Ukrainian time, and that was in the middle of when those drones were happening. So, there were 35 drones that attacked, 30 were shot down. Some of those figures yesterday, some of the figures today. As I say, artillery systems important. 2 helicopters as well. So there, and you'll see that's a report I'm just about to say. 7 vehicles and fuel tanks, 2 other pieces of special equipment. So fuel tanks are really important. But yeah, 7 artillery systems. That's your vital one. Two enemy helicopters shot down, according to the general staff yesterday. No more details on that at the moment, but that is obviously a real blow for the Russians, especially if that includes the crew inside. If they survived and got back to Russian lines, then that's a real bonus for the Russians in losing the helicopters. At least they get to keep the crew, but if they lost the crew as well, then they can replace helicopters relatively easily, as in they've probably got a stock of those, but they won't have a stock of trained pilots and crew in the same way. That's more difficult. Ukrainian forces have conducted precision strikes on Tokmak and Polohi. So this is down in the Melitopol area around here. There is a lot of, so the Russians are still saying that the Ukrainians are, at the moment, amassing troops in this Zaporizhzhia area. There are 3 places they reported along here that the Ukrainians are amassing troops, and it looks like the Ukrainians are also doing softening activities with HIMARS and artillery in the same way they did in the Kherson region. So you're getting a lot of places hit around here. The Russians are also claiming they're amassed troops and also building defenses around Melitopol. It does look like there could be an attack down to particularly Tokmak and Melitopol, as I've been saying. If it's not, then it's a very good decoy. But then, of course, the Ukrainians have been telegraphing this by saying that they're going to attack down there, as I was saying last week. But anyway, Tokmak and Polohi, 15 units of equipment were destroyed or damaged, 100 plus soldiers were killed in action and wounded in action. There were also attacks, HIMARS attacks on Alchevsk, Shastia, which is round about here, and Novosilka, which is another Novosilka, but it's somewhere around this area. I haven't been able to locate it on the map. But that has caused trouble as well. So as we carry on, Ukrainian intel says that Russia has received another 250 more kamikaze drones, the Shahed 131s and 136s. That is unsurprising. Iran keep denying this, but it's happening clearly. According to Bloomberg, in the near future, Ukraine will receive about 10,000 more Starlink satellite communication terminals. That's excellent news. I don't know whether that is Musk. It's probably more likely paid for. That's been put in place by the Americans, by the US aid packages, and there's another big US aid package going out. There's another UK one, another Finnish one. There is continuing support for Ukraine. There's one that's just been sent to Congress for a big old package of aid. But at the same time, Izium has been hit. So Izium is now in Ukrainian hands. It's up here during that lightning counteroffensive. That was hit last night by the Russians, and it was a pretty big hit by the looks of it. Fire broke out. So interesting to see how they did that and what they've hit. Not sure yet. Anyway, let's get to the front lines. There's enough preamble. We're going to start in our northeast area, Kupiansk-Svatove-Kreminna here. So this is on my map. As we start up the north, not too much news about what's happening. In fact, when you look at the Russian, so I've been told reliably, I hope that this is pronounced Rebar. In fact, you roll your R, Rebar. In the Starobilsk direction, they say there are no significant changes to frontline. Russian troops are fighting positional battles with Ukrainian formations in the vicinity of Ploshchanka and Chernomypivka. Along the entire line of contact, artillery duels continue. So that's a really kind of like, yeah, stuff's happening everywhere. It's mainly happening around Ploshchanka and Chernomypivka down south here. But let's have a look at a few details around here. Chernomypivka, this area, so Svatova's there. This seems to be the area towards which the Russians are constantly doing counterattacks. So there's that. We've got the Ukrainians getting shelled in Berestova, Stelmakivka, sorry. Russian forces to try to stall the advance and keep the Ukrainians busy by doing small counterattacks in the Stelmakivka area while prepping defense. And Luhansko VA Haidai, so this is the Ukrainian leader in the area, says that the Ukrainian are advancing to Novotarasivka. Again, this is something that I reported yesterday. So let's get to the right place, shall we? This is up here near Yahidny. So there is this, I mean, that's been going on for a week now. The advance towards there, lots of sort of artillery duels all the way down, same old sort of thing. And then we get down to Ploshchanka and Chernomypivka. Okay, so the latest it seems is that there's a lot of activity towards Holikova. So Holikova is there, which is over the other side of the P66 highway, which you can now see indicated there, and Ploshchanka. So it turns out, this is according, by the way, to reporting from Ukraine, who said that actually over the last few days, the Russians did some counterattacks that lost the Ukrainians a whole bunch of position around Chernomypivka and Ploshchanka, but now the Ukrainians have got that back, and it appears that they could even have an area like that as they are fighting towards Krasny Rachensky, as well as Holikova too. This is the scene of a lot of activity. So the counterattacks could have given Ukraine more land. I'm not changing my map there, but over the next couple of days, I'm going to have a look around this area to see whether actually that bears out and whether reporting from Ukraine is correct in the fact that there is increased Ukrainian land around this area. Now we come down south towards Kreminna, Dobrova. There's a lot of activity. In fact, the Russians have been shelling positions around Dobrova, which is to say that the Ukrainians are there, and I think other positions within the forest as well. So the Ukrainians are under pressure from Russian shelling in a forested area, which is not something you particularly usually see, because there's a lot of cover afforded to people operating around those sorts of regions. As we come further down south, I am going to remove this line here from this kind of these attacks up towards Serebianka. However, it does look like the Russians have moved a little bit further forward around this area. If we look at, say, Defmon here, so the Ukrainians repulsed attacks around Belorivka and Verkhnokamayanska. Wolgonzo reports Russian attacks in the direction of Vasily and Vyimka. Russian MOD claims strikes on Ukrainian positions near Dobrova, which confirms the front line of the area. So that's kind of stuff that we've been talking about. But that's coming, here is Verkhnokamayanska. And we did have Ukrainians doing quite well around there, pushing eastwards. But it seems like the Russians have been counterattacking quite well. Belorivka is fiercely contested over. And then we have Vyimka here and Vasily there. So there is attacks towards Vasily from Yakovlivka, and we know that the Ukrainians are building defences just south of Vasily, but it could be that the Russians all along this front are putting a lot of pressure to move westwards. As we come down to Bakhmut, the ISW, for example, says that there are repelled attacks, Vyimka, Brestova, Yakovlivka, Soledar. The worry is that Soledar becomes isolated. So if you look at Defmon here, it says uh, here, it seems the Ukrainians are managing to hold the defensive lines in and south of Bakhmut. What we need to keep an eye on is the area around Soledar and Yakovlivka. The most dangerous thing now would be if the Russians managed to isolate Soledar. And this would be, a bit of a worry. There's Soledar. If they can get, you can see there's a bit of a heightened, elevated area to the north of Soledar. So they can come from Yakovlivka and come down, whilst also breaking through north of Pihorodna and isolate Soledar and Bakhmutska. That will be a real problem because that would be the key to Bakhmut falling, as places to the south are as well. But it seems like they're holding at the moment. All these places are scenes of fighting: Pihorodna, Opitny, Klishchivka, and then down to Kurdyumivka and Ozaryanivka. So all of those, the usual. Let's see what Rebars say. Well, actually, in the Soledar sector, Ukrainian command is strengthening defences to counter a potential Russian offensive in the direction of Soledar, and that's what you'd expect given what I've just said. In the Bakhmut area, assault units of Wagner PMC continue fighting in Bakhmut and Opitny. The enemy is pulling in reserves and preparing for a counter-attack on the positions of the Russian armed forces in Ozaryanivka and Klishchivka. So, not hardly any detail around there. Bakhmut No report says the Ukrainians counterattacked and pushed the Russians out of the eastern suburbs to the area around the MO3 MO6 crossing, and I'll show you that in a second. Advance in the Opitny area by 500 meters. I talked to you about that yesterday in both videos. And the Russians claim they took Bilorivka. No visual evidence given yet. Fighting ongoing near Kurdyumivka. Okay, let's make some sense of that. Bilorivka is up here, and again, the claim Russians. No reports said that yesterday. Russians claim that, no evidence of that yet, but be worried about that because that could well have happened. We just don't know. It's interesting. The Institute for the Study of War says quite a lot of stuff on Bakhmut. One of the things it says is that a Russian military correspondent reportedly embedded in a unit fighting south of Bakhmut admitted on December the 18th that Ukrainian forces managed to dislodge Russian troops from unspecified positions they fought for all autumn. In other words, just in one day, the Russians have had to retreat from a position that they took all autumn to get, and that is almost certainly this 500 meters in Opitny. So it could be that the Russians have had a really tough time in Opitny. The Ukrainians have done a successful counterattack, and they've pushed the Russians right out of there. Also over here, there are some mappers. So if I get on my editing tool, there are some mappers say most mappers seem to indicate, apart from sort of deep defense politics Asia, seems to have the Russians still in here, but most mappers have the Russians out of the eastern outskirts, and in fact, there are some that seem to indicate that they're sort of right back here, this open ground. Obviously, it's going to be very hard to maintain open ground there, so control over that would require you to be along this road or over there. You're not going to be just sat in the middle of an open field, really. If you look at the War Mapper map, which is a lovely clear map, that says that there are two key areas where they have been pushed back, one in Opitny and one around here. So this is that road, Fedora Makisimienko Street, something like that. It looks like they've been pushed back on that open ground there. But there's heavy fighting for this area near the industrial unit. So this is this triangle there that they're still fighting for, coming in through this industrial area. And I reported yesterday there are some claims that the Ukrainians had taken back the winery around there. I haven't heard anything about that since then. We shall see what we find out about that. And the area of the MO3 MO6 crossing could well be this area back here. So that's why I've moved the Russian lines back there. The key, as I said yesterday, is this waste sorting plant that the Ukrainians took back control of. And it seems like a successful counterattack from the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, and that should please all pro-Ukrainians because this was beginning to look a bit worrying. It was a bit of a surprise attack. The Ukrainians apparently weren't expecting them to attack around here, It was an unlikely sort of attack to do, and yet it happened. So there you go. Expect the unexpected, I guess. Um, then it's a case of Konimivka, Klishchivka, Ozaryanivka further down south. Opitny still fiercely contested. Not 100% sure the Russian lines around just around Klishchivka, but Klishchivka is very well fortified. And then there's talk about sort of attacks around here, this sort of triangle from that entrenched area. I gave you video evidence of that being bombarded. This triangle up here, there's, I think, activity there, and this is where the Russians are trying to push. So there's fighting around here. Other than that, we'll move on further down south to Maryinka. In all honesty, very little news out of anywhere around here. Toretsk, New York, and Shumi up there. To the north, there is some reports that the Russians are fighting north of Avdivka in their attempt to encircle it. In this particular Krasnohorivka, I say that because there's another Krasnohorivka down there. It's Ukraine after all. Everywhere has like 57 versions of a town. There's fighting around Pervomaisky, but repelled attacks from the Russians around Pervomaisky and Novelsky, which is this small settlement here, which has a lot of entrenchments around it, a lot of earthen trenches and defences. And then we come down to Krasnohorivka and Maryinka. The reason why Maryinka seems to be quite well, ideally, what the Russians would like to do in Maryinka is take Maryinka, obviously, and then really it's going to be Kurakova here because that's a transport hub. You've got some, important logistics around there. So you've got fighting towards, Alexandra Pil, Krasnohorivka, Maryinka, obviously, and Pobieda. So Pobieda is quite key because if you look behind Pobieda, there's just a whole load of open ground. So if they can take that, then that gives them the advance onto Kurakova and all these settlements to the south as well, which means that they don't have to do a frontal assault on Vuhledar, which is further down south there. This is why the Ukrainians have been fighting hard to do counterattacks in Pobieda and have actually had some success pushing the Russians back and pushing the Russians back in Novomykhailivka as well. So they understand that, but Maryinka is still the big tough one. Now, the claims the other day that the Russians control 70% of Maryinka, 90% of this. It is quite. It can be a little bit distorting because the center of Maryinka that they're fighting over now and have been for some time isn't in the center of the city. Actually, there's quite a large amount of the settlement. It depends how much area you define as Maryinka. So, if it goes all the way back here and is all of that, then that is somewhat larger than this area there, but it could go even further back depending on whether, you include all of this as Maryinka, so on and so forth. So anyway, it's just a bit of statistics. There have been apparently some repelled attacks in the northeast coming from the Russians around here, but apparently, according to some Russian sources, they have broken through some lines of defense in the center. That's according to Institute for the Study of War. But the details on that are pretty thin on the ground. Russian sources also widely claim that Russian troops broke through the Ukrainian defenses in Maryinka city centre on December the 18th, so that's yesterday, and are advancing further west on December. No, sorry, 2 days ago, and then advancing further west on the 19th yesterday. Where that is exactly, who knows? There's no real details on that. But if that has happened, that would be slightly worrying because Maryinka, really needs to hold out. It's a bit like Bakhmut here. It's a meat grinder that is fixing forces in place. But if it was lost, then you could get a sort of domino effect, or you might not. It depends. Other places could hold out. It's just that there would be nowhere as big as Maryinka until you get sort of further back to Kurakova, really. So it is really important that Ukrainians hold on there. As we come further down south, Riba has to say not a lot about the Vuhledar area, but we do have some claims from no reports. So Russians keep attacking small waves near Novomykhailivka, target unknown. Positional battles continue near Pervomaisky. That's I've already told you about that. So really not a lot of information from that southern part. So it's more happening up here. Pobieda, Novomykhailivka on the way to Maryinka rather than down here in Pavlivka Merkilska and Vuhledar. So I think the Russians have learned that beating their head against a brick wall for the 58th time is probably not the cleverest thing to do. Just before we move on to finish up, the Vuhledar is not being attacked straight on, but it is still being blanketed with Russian fire, artillery fire, and whatnot, shelling. So the Vuhledar and its surroundings is under Russian fire. On the Donetsk side, shelling of Maryinka, yep, of course, and the outskirts of a few other communities were recorded without casualties. So there is, constant shelling of these places. Artillery duels happen all along the Zaporizhia line. And in fact, let's go and have a little think about that. So not too much news out of Velika Novosilka and Nishkushnya area, where there has been quite a bit of activity over the last few days, as well as Novomayorsk and Shevchenko. No news out there as far as I know at the moment. However, let's just return to this idea that the Ukrainians could well be amassing troops in these areas, as has been claimed by the Russians continually, and they are softening up places like Tokmak, areas around Melitopol, areas behind the Russian lines here. Well, this is what Tim White says, who I've interviewed twice on the channel, so you can go and check them out. My prediction a while ago that Melitopol would be the next big population centre to be liberated looks to be coming closer. The occupiers seem to have a news blackout, ignoring recent explosions, including 2 last night. Locals report Vasilievka checkpoint is not working. And it goes on to say it is speculation, but this news, allied to reports from Novobodanivka, make Melitopol area look like Kherson was 6 weeks ago. Locals say occupiers are closing their barracks and loading beds and looted goods onto trucks likely to depart the village soon. And that's really interesting because it is playing out just like Kherson. So that settlement he was just talking about, Tim White, there. So we've got Tokmak there, which is this big logistics hubs in terms of road, but also the rail passes through there. And here's the place that he's talking about, just to the north of Melitopol. So if they're looting around there, they're pulling out beds from barracks, all sorts of things, and there's a news blackout, and the Ukrainians definitely have been softening targets around here, then it could well be that this counterattack that I think Zaluzhny mentioned the other day, one of the Ukrainian military leaders was talking about, we have got everything in place for one counterattack. We'd like to do 3, but we need more. We need more equipment and resources to do that, but we can do 1. Well, is that 1 going to be around here, or are they softening up around the Ploshchanka, Chervonopepivka area? Although apparently that's just really bogged down by the weather at the moment. It's just so muddy up there that it's really difficult to move. Is it more likely to be, cutting down, as I've talked about many times before on different videos, cutting down through Tokmak, and maybe not taking Melitopol, but you cut through the railway line that goes there, and even cut as far as to the coast, do something like that, where if it's too thin, you can be sort of cut off behind you in the rear. If you do something like that, have some kind of bigger salient, then that might make a lot of sense. And then it completely isolates Kherson, completely isolates Crimea, because the Kerch Bridge is still not operational, and this will then cause all sorts of logistical problems for troops and civilians, I guess, in this whole area, and might force a hand of the Russians. Would the Ukrainians then take that opportunity, if that succeeded, take that opportunity to squeeze further on? So if they did something like that, as I was just saying, and then you can squeeze through here and actually take the opportunity to cross a river. I know it's a big risk, but if the Russians are in disarray, thinking about having to move their own troops from the Kherson region and Crimea to support the defenses around Melitopol, then that would be the opportunity to do an attack in the rear across the river. Although crossing the river is obviously going to be a dangerous thing to do. It leaves them open to be attacked by the Russians as they're doing so. But it could look something like that, and then you kind of squeeze and squeeze and squeeze until it becomes a house of cards or dominoes. That would be the perfect scenario for the Ukrainians. Whether that happened is anyone's guess. Anyway, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you want to support my channel, there are lots of ways to do it. You can go onto uasupporter.com/ATP, and if you put /ATP, you can, and you get anything here, then my channel gets a tiny little bit of commission, and that's really appreciated. So you can get yourself a hat, maybe a beanie. It's wintertime, it's cold. Get yourself a beanie to show your support for Ukraine and support to my channel a little bit. Or you can just pop along, buy any of my books. Look for Johnny Pierce on Amazon, or Jonathan M.S. Pierce if you're interested in philosophy. Here is a selection of them. Lots of books written by Jonathan M.S. Pierce. Those are all my ones who philosophy, mainly philosophy of religion. If you're interested, it's Christmas. If you're interested in seeing whether the Nativity actually historically happened, there's a historical analysis. Loads of great reviews for that book. That is a thoroughly interesting read on the historical analysis of the Nativity accounts. Or you can just go and look at some fiction, some dystopian horror fiction, or some young adult fiction, Curse of the Maya series, or the Survival of the Fittest series. Or just get family book of Word of the Day for a year, every year, forever. All my books there. Please check them out. Any support in buying my books is hugely appreciated. Thank you so much. You take care. I'll see you later.